This video was made possible by Brilliant. Learn with Brilliant for 20% off by being one of the first 200 to sign up at brilliant.org/Wendover. For the longest while, airlines treated pilots as a renewable resource. It was long considered one of the best jobs one could have, to make good money flying around the world in comfort, but as aviation has become more commonplace, the job of pilot has too become more and more just like any other job. While in the 50s the job garnered the same respect and pay as a doctor, entering the industry today earns you not much more than you'd make at a fast food restaurant. Before a pilot can even perform their first takeoff with passengers in the back, they have to get licensed. Most top airline jobs require or strongly favor those with a college diploma, so for those that want to go all the way in the field, they have to start by getting a degree. The cost of that averages $133,000 in the US, and then every aspiring commercial pilot first needs to get a private pilot's license, which requires 35 hours of flight time. These first bits of flight time, which are with an instructor, typically cost about $140 an hour or $4,900 total. You also have to take classes, which have their own fees, so getting a private pilot's license usually costs about $8,000 all in. To start actually making money as a pilot though, you need 15 additional hours of instruction for an instrument rating costing $900, and an additional 215 hours of flight time costing $23,500. There are also tons of other smaller costs for books and housing and transportation and other things, which bring the total cost of a pilot's training to at least $80,000. Having done all that, having spent $213,000 on education so far, one finally receives a commercial pilot's license, but still, at that point, one can't work for most airlines. To get an airline transport pilot license, the one needed to work for large commercial airlines by the likes of Delta or KLM or Cathay Pacific, one needs, with some exception, 1,500 flight hours. That would cost an additional $136,000 in rental fees alone if one were to pay for the flight time themselves, so pilots normally let someone else pay for it by working at a job that doesn't require a full ATP license. The most common job used to get from 250 to 1,500 hours is as a flight instructor, but some also work flying skydiving planes, towing banners, or for airlines flying small single-engine planes. Once that's all done, after having been in education continuously for a quarter of one's life until the age of 23, and having spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, one can finally start flying commercial passenger planes and earning $30,000 a year. That's a typical and even fair starting salary for a first-year first officer, and considering these individuals often have tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, young pilots are often in a tough financial situation. Most American pilots start their commercial careers at regional airlines. The largest of these is SkyWest Airlines, which is an airline that flies for other airlines. You could be flying any of the three major American airlines, Delta, United, or American, and actually be on a SkyWest-operated flight. SkyWest, along with other regional airlines, operate all planes for these US airlines with under 76 seats. They fly the smallest planes, which are actually more expensive on a per-passenger basis to operate than the larger planes. The regional airlines' primary purpose is to lower cost. The aviation industry is heavily unionized, so the major airlines would never be allowed to bring in pilots at a yearly salary of $20,000 or $30,000. Therefore, they contract these regional carriers to operate these small, expensive planes so the crew can be employed at a different pay scale even if the flights are branded as United or Delta or American. While a first-year first officer for American Airlines makes $88 per flight hour, a first-year first officer for SkyWest only makes $37. Pilots are only allowed to fly 900 hours per calendar year in the US, which works out to 75 hours per month or about 17 hours per week. Now, the idea of a 17-hour workweek probably sounds great, but these are only the hours in command of an airborne aircraft. They don't account for the time it takes to get to the airport, clear security, brief for the flight, inspect and prep the aircraft, board passengers, deplane passengers, pack up, file paperwork, and get home or to a hotel. Pilots are primarily paid based on hours in the air, which is why you tend to see the more senior pilots flying the longer routes. A typical 4-day trip for a regional pilot in the US might see them flying on Monday from Minneapolis to Fargo, Fargo to Minneapolis, Minneapolis to Pittsburgh, then Pittsburgh to Boston where they would stay overnight. The next day, Tuesday, they would fly from Boston to Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh to Boston, then Boston to Nashville. After an overnight, they would fly from Nashville to Boston, Boston to Jacksonville, and Jacksonville to Boston. Finally, on Thursday, they would fly from Boston to Norfolk, and then Norfolk to Minneapolis. Over that 4-day, 12-leg trip, they would be in the air for just over 19 hours. that regional pilot would have been almost constantly either working, sleeping, or eating. Compare that to a long-haul pilot flying an A330. They would leave Atlanta on a Monday night, fly to Amsterdam arriving Tuesday morning, and fly back Thursday after having had a full 48 hours free in Amsterdam. On that trip, the pilot would have accumulated 16 flight hours, not all that different from the hours that the regional pilot gained after working constantly for 4 days. It's no wonder why the most senior pilots, who have the seniority to decide which type of plane and routes they fly, almost always go for the long-haul routes. Meanwhile, while the young pilots don't get paid much and work tougher schedules, the advantage for them of working for these regional airlines is that they can gain the experience and hours needed to get a job at a more desirable airline. The problem that the airline industry is facing is that not enough people are willing to put themselves through all the years of expensive training, low pay, and long hours to get to the stage where they make the good money and fly the most interesting routes. There is a shortage of pilots, but it's hard to know how bad this shortage is. Some say it's a myth, others will say it's already chronic, but by one estimate, the US alone will have 1,600 pilot jobs unfilled by 2020. While the problem is only predicted to get worse, the shortage of pilots is already having consequences. Emirates Airlines denies having any pilot shortage, but the reality is that in April 2018, they flew 36 777s and 10 A380s over to Dubai World Central Airport, a less busy airport than the main Dubai airport, and left those airplanes there on the ground for months because there just weren't enough pilots to fly them. The concerning thing is, Emirates pilots are some of the best paid in the industry. Even young Emirates pilots make more than $200,000 per year, and thanks to local laws, that's tax-free income. Emirates has come under criticism for long work hours, insufficient rest periods, and minimal pilot staffing for their longest haul flights, which is likely a contributing factor to their difficulty in attracting pilots. But if they're having trouble recruiting pilots while paying so much, that's not a great sign for the industry. These high salaries from some airlines are also a contributing factor to the shortage in the US and Europe, though. The UAE is a small country with 2 massive airlines, so they rely on recruiting foreign pilots. China, while not a small country, also doesn't have enough local pilots to staff their tremendously fast-growing airline industry. The country's airlines therefore pay a starting salary of $312,000 per year to foreign pilots, and some make up to $500,000. While working conditions are tough, it's still no wonder why 10% of all pilots in China are now foreigners. With more and more pilots heading overseas to the best-paying pilot jobs, the US, Europe, and other Western countries are left with fewer and fewer people to fly their planes. The short-term solution for airlines in the US has been to fast-track pilots through the early phase of their careers flying small jets for low pay and get more pilots flying the larger planes earlier. That leaves the brunt of the impact of this shortage on small towns served by these small planes. US airlines especially, thanks to the country's vastness, operate with route networks emphasizing service to small airports. Rather amazingly, there are 553 airports in the US with commercial service. United is perhaps the most focused among the big 3 US airlines on small-town service with 235 domestic destinations, but due to the lack of pilots, it's having to cancel routes. In September 2018 alone, the airline stopped service from Chicago to Willard, Illinois, Mobile, Alabama, and Manchester, New Hampshire, even though these routes were likely profitable. United isn't alone in this. Horizon Air, the subsidiary operating Alaska Airlines' regional flights, had to cancel thousands of flights in 2017 due to a severe lack of pilots. There are a couple of possible solutions to this crisis. The most obvious one is to increase pay and to improve working conditions, but from the airlines' perspectives, that's the last-ditch solution as they focus on their bottom lines. While it's tough to sympathize with these billion-dollar businesses losing money as a result of paying a more livable wage, the reality is that if they're having to pay more for the pilots to serve small towns, it's going to cost more to fly to small towns, and those living in small towns are often the ones least able to pay. Another commonly proposed solution is to attract more women pilots. Only 6.7% of the world's pilots are female, and so, by putting more effort into recruiting that half of the population, airlines could potentially increase pilot numbers without increasing pay. More and more airlines, such as Lufthansa and Emirates, are also operating their own flight schools where cadets can train for reduced rates or for free as long as they end up working at the airline. Airlines are also working to reduce the number of pilots needed. Emirates, for example, reduced the number of pilots it uses on some of its longest flights. On the 13-hour flight from Dubai to Sydney, for example, they now only staff 3 pilots instead of 4, which means that each only gets 4 hours of in-flight rest instead of 6. Finally, one of the more controversial proposals to fix this issue has been to increase automation in the cockpit to the point where only 1 or possibly 0 pilots are needed to fly. This proposal has met criticism from pilots, cabin crew, and the public alike, as many opponents point out that the cockpit is already highly automated and the pilot's main role is to troubleshoot if things go wrong. Nonetheless, with captains of wide-body planes earning more than $300 per flight hour, the cost of crewing the cockpit can be as much as $19,000 each way on the longest flights like San Francisco to Singapore, so there's certainly financial pressure on airlines to cut down the need for pilots if they can. There are thousands of people who become pilots each year, but there are millions more who want to become pilots. To bring more people into the industry, all airlines need to do is to lower the extraordinarily high barrier to entry, since as the industry grows worldwide, the allure of the skies won't be enough to get enough pilots into the cockpit. If you want to become a pilot, 2 of the major things you absolutely need to have a solid grasp of are math and physics. Brilliant is a great place to learn those 2 subjects since their courses break down concepts into their intuitive principles and build them back up so you don't just memorize how to do something, you understand it. They also have plenty of other courses on super interesting subjects like logic, probability, astronomy, machine learning, and more. They really put a lot of work into perfecting each and every course they have, and best of all, you can sign up for Brilliant at brilliant.org/Wendover and access some courses for free. Then, by being one of the first 200 to use that same link, you will also get 20% off when you upgrade to Premium, and you'll be helping to support Wendover Productions.